and dummy up positions that ended up being twice the value of the actual institution. I'm sure that was in their policy, and yet he got away with it. This man wreaked havoc not only in his own institution, but around the world. There was the controlled sell-off here, there was the panic sell-off in Asia, and when this hit the news in January, it happened to be the Martin Luther King holiday in the US. So the markets were closed. And thank God they were, or our markets would have sunk even lower than they are right now. We, as it happened, our Federal Reserve only cut interest rates by several basis points. They said it was coincidental. I think it was as a result, but it could have been much worse impact in U.S. markets had it not been for that trading holiday. But he really was the shot heard around the world. So this is where we see the actions of one crazy employee can really have a worldwide impact depending on the size and the scope of the business. Do I have to go on? I mean, I just found these statistics interesting. $7.21 billion, 5 billion euro. That's equivalent to 1 week's worth of U.S. oil imports. Or at least it was in January. It may be a little less now. The cost of 2 Freedom Towers at ground zero and nearly double Bolivia's foreign debt. That's how much one man on a rampage managed to trade in one institution because he was able to circumvent policies and procedures. And the killer part of this story is when he was caught doing it several times, he always managed to talk his way out of it. Then he would run back and say he made a mistake and run back and cancel the trade and everything was all right, and they let him get away with it a couple of times. This was a really good example of really, really bad governance. The punchline to this story, this is my favorite quote of all of them, if left alone to trade himself out of the position, he would make back billions. You just give me 2 weeks, I'll make it all back. You rarely only hear that at the blackjack table in Las Vegas. But this is what he said. The other punchline is that this exact thing had happened several times before. Probably the second most famous case of rogue trading was in 1991 when Nicholas Leeson sunk Barclays Bank. You remember that one? Completely sunk Barclays Bank because he was doing essentially the same thing. So the precedent goes back years. And it happened to Barings Bank. It also happened to the U.S. affiliate of Irish Allied Bank. So there's precedent for this kind of behavior. And it wasn't just 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. This kind of thing has been going on for years. And performance over that amount of time within these financial institutions, the same thing keeps happening every few years or so. When is the financial services industry going to change their policies and procedures? When are we going to actually see better governance in action? With all the spending we're doing on governance and risk and compliance, why are these major issues still happening? It's a question. Where is our performance against the spending that we're doing? Let's talk about compliance for a moment. Why is compliance important? Does anyone have the answer yet? Well, it goes back to another individual. Now, this story you may not be familiar with because it happened 2 or 3 years ago in the United States. Although in Discover Magazine, you can find it this month's issue at discovermagazine.com, there was an excellent story about this. A young man, his name was Eric Drew, young man, prime of his life, regularly donated blood, and one day his blood tests, he had been feeling not too well, starting to run down, and the nurse, when he was giving blood, checked him out and found out he was a little bit anemic. It turns out that in a few weeks later he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he went downhill very, very fast. So that within 2 or 3 months he ended up at a hospice, the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. Now at this hospice they also did experimental treatments for cancer, and Eric Drew enrolled himself in the experimental treatment program. As part of his daily therapy, his blood was drawn by a phlebotomist named Richard Gibson. That was the man that worked with him most often. Now, instead of looking down with compassion and saying, here's a patient that I'm going to help, Richard Gibson looked down and said, here's a dead man. I think what I'll do is steal his identity, open up some credit cards, and go shopping. And that's exactly what he did. Within a few weeks, he ran up over $9,000 in debt, and he spent it on all of the essentials of life: clothing, jewelry, Xboxes, all the basics that you need to survive, right? Unbelievable. Eric Drew started receiving collection notices In his hospital bed, he started receiving unpaid bill notices from credit cards he knew he didn't have. He contacted the credit agencies, he begged them to freeze his accounts. He contacted the card issuers and said, I am not opening up any new lines of credit. Please help me. But, you know, they have to make their numbers too, so if they get an application with what looks like legitimate information on it, odds are they're going to go ahead and open up the account, and that's exactly what he did. Soon $9,000 turned into $15,000, and $15,000 turned into nearly $30,000. And he was, this poor man in the hospice, dying, is still racking up all this debt because of Richard Gibson, his phlebotomist, who, by the way, comes into his hospital room every day and looks him in the eye as he's doing this. It finally attracted the attention of a local consumer affairs reporter in Seattle. And together, Eric Drew and Chris Daniels at KING TV, they put their heads together and they started doing some forensic investigation. And their trail very quickly led to Richard Gibson. Very quickly. So when the police came to arrest him, he confessed. He didn't contest the charges. He pled guilty in front of a judge. The judge in the case was absolutely disgusted with him. He said, you know, if I weren't bound by sentencing guidelines, I would sentence you to many years in prison, but the maximum they could give him was 16 months. They have sentencing guidelines. But the judge said, you know, I would understand if you stole this money to feed your starving children, but to buy jewelry, that's despicable. I know this is a fascinating story. What does it have to do with compliance, right? The interesting thing about this particular case is that Richard Gibson was the first person in the U.S. to be convicted of the unlawful use of individually identifiable health information. He wasn't convicted for theft. He wasn't convicted for fraud. He was convicted for misusing personal information. Now, typically, in the U.S., for healthcare organizations, we have privacy laws, and typically those laws are applied to the institution. In this case, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance was held harmless because there was no malfeasance on the part of the institution. It was clearly the actions of one bad person. So he was convicted criminally under a law that typically applies to institutions. What does that have to do with compliance? I'm getting there. Typically with compliance, remember I said at the beginning that it was more practical, it was more tactical, it was the checklist that we use to make sure we're doing the right things. When we look at that checklist and we see all the things we have to do, this is all the compliance stuff I have to do in addition to my information security work. This is the huge checklist that I have to just check off because the audit is in 2 weeks. We start to get overwhelmed by this and we lose sight of the harm that can come to our employees, to our customers, to individuals who put their trust in us when they give us their data. We're completely forgetting about the harm that can happen to that person. And you know what? My data may be resident in your system. Your data may be resident in his system. So we're all just one data breach away from ending up like Eric Drew. And we forget that. We forget that there's a human at the end of all this compliance and all this governance and all this spending. We forget that there's actual harm that can happen to a person. Let's just compare the two incidents for a moment. Yeah, they're very different. One was a compliance violation, one was a governance violation. As I said, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance was held harmless as an institution because it was not their fault. It was not, it was not policy to allow employees to steal patients' credit card data. Societe Generale, of course, is still under investigation. They probably will be held accountable at some level for these actions because they didn't have appropriate governance in place and because Jerome Kerviel was able to talk his way out of trouble a couple of times. But even though one was governance and one was a compliance failure, there are a lot of similarities. The organizations themselves, at the time of these breaches were discovered, were in compliance with industry standards. They did have appropriate policies and procedures in place. It was the individuals that clearly violated those policies. And oddly enough, both individuals, both Richard Gibson and Kerviel, seem to have been able to rationalize this behavior to themselves. They both claim they had good reason. Yeah, good reason for stealing 5 billion euro. I want to know that reason. Neither considered their actions a crime, but clearly, were their actions a crime? Absolutely.